Good afternoon, Lovelace. The PowerPoint should be up in a minute. So why inside and outside the classroom, and why are classrooms like prisons? Does anybody think a classroom is like a prison? Has anybody ever felt a classroom is like a prison? You know, your teachers aren't going to know who says that. So I'm not here to propose a jailbreak, just so that it's clear. I'm not here to say that you all have to break away physically from your classrooms, because your classrooms usually don't have bars, at least not on all sides. What I'm interested in, though I will be talking about the more serious kind of prison, the physical kind of prison, I'm also interested in the prisons of the mind. Great. That's the best.
Louder, please.
Louder? Do you want to get a mic? Sure. Sure, we can do a mic. It's okay. So why inside and outside of prison? And we just click forward on this if we have a remote sometime. First, we'll start with this quote. Does anybody recognize the quote? Never let your schooling interfere with your education. The quote's from this guy, and I'm going to bounce back and forth here to... Where do we go? From Mark Twain, right? Which you probably know of if you know of Mark Twain is as an author of things like Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer. What's less known about him because of the prisons that our schools put our minds in, Mark Twain was also a political writer, and from the time of the Spanish-American War, which the Americans pitched as liberating Cuba from Spain, but was actually at the time adding Cuba to their addition of Cuba to a part of the American Empire. He was vice president of an organization called the Anti-Imperialist League in the States, which opposed American wars of conquest overseas. So the Twain that they teach you about in school when you read nice novels, well, interesting novels, or other humorous literature, he was still humorous. He was very funny as a satirical writer, but he was writing about deadly serious topics as well. So, but the quote about not letting schooling interfere with your education is this idea of schools as prisons, not just because, so there are some things about schools which are a little bit like prisons, right? So is it true? Yeah, yes and no. I remember the impression of being in school and feeling like you're doing time. You've got to do so many hours to get a credit, so many credits to get your diploma or your degree or whatever to get out, right? And there's no time off for good behavior. Sometimes there's time off for bad behavior. But there is that sense of doing time, right? Doing time in prison is a bit different. We can talk about that if you want. However, there are things about school which are not like prison. School can be a place of liberation. So it can be a place of constraint, where they only tell you certain messages and they want you to get certain messages. It can be a place of liberation in very practical terms. You can learn skills with your hands or with your mind that allow you to earn a living, change your own circumstances. That's pretty cool. It can also be a place where, quite apart from learning a living, you can learn things which help you be a freer person in your community. So a quote that I like to turn to is from a great teacher of mine and many others, Muriel Duckworth, the founder of an organization called Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. And Muriel always said that education and the peace movement have the same root, the idea of knowledge. So if you know about the world, you can be a freer person. You want to put a mic on. Good idea. And it's something to make that work without me bumping into furniture. So knowing about the world. Oops. So how does a professor of linguistics find out about people in prison? Some of it because I was an activist before I was a professor. So it wasn't a professor who turned an activist, it was an activist who turned a professor. But even in my professional life, I've had occasion to run into things. When I came to London, I marched with people like Lorraine and others for peace, for different kinds of justice. I marched on a lot of picket lines. So actually the first few times I came to Fanshawe, I was walking with your support staff and with your academic staff on a picket line. And some of the most important lessons I've learned about the world, I've learned on picket lines. Labor picket lines in particular are a great place to learn. And I encourage you, should it happen to happen during your educational career, not to view it as just an interruption in your life, which it is, and it's supposed to be, but also as an opportunity to walk with the people who normally provide the services that your education depends on in the classroom and outside the classroom, and learn from them the reasons why they're there and the discipline it takes to run an effective strike, both in terms of the mechanics of a picket line which are very important, but also in the messages that you take to the public, which is a very important part, has been a very important part of my education, because the practical solidarity of walking in that sort of flattened circle oval on a picket line is also one of the lessons that we took with us, not just me, but many other people, when we do things elsewhere, like challenge the blockade of Gaza. But even in my academic career, and we're going to get to those funny faces at the bottom, a researcher in linguistics, a topic that on the surface of it had nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with prisons or anything like it. I was interested in real, like, hardcore linguistics, word nerd stuff, right? Like pronouns. You don't want, I won't lecture you on pronouns, I promise. So I'm interested in pronouns. I'm in Spain working on some surveys of dialects that were done 70, 80 years ago or longer in Spain by these guys along the bottoms. And I realized that one of the reasons I can't find their original field notes is because this research, these guys along the bottom did their research from 1930 to 1936 during the period of the Spanish Republic, the first democratically elected government in Spain. That Republic government came to an end in 1936 because of a fascist nationalist uprising which threw out the democratically elected government that these guys worked for. What does this have to do with me? Well, it means that their materials, the data I needed for my word nerd stuff, wasn't easily available. But I then became interested in their stories, and it turns out that of these 8 guys, this one, the leader of the project, the director, Navarro Tomas, went into exile as a result of the war. Anibal and Manuel both did time in prison because they were identified with the Republican government. And in the case of Anibal in particular, he was picked up basically because he was carrying notebooks in phonetic transcription, the special alphabet we use in linguistics, which was used as proof by the military authorities that he must be a spy, because they didn't understand it, right? And people who don't have knowledge assume that what they don't understand must be something scary and dangerous. Linguists are really scary and dangerous people. So, automatic assumption, he's a spy, he's sentenced to death by firing squad. One of the other directors of the project intervenes on his behalf. They very magnanimously commute his death sentence to life imprisonment. He ends up getting out on a pardon after doing 6 years in a prison camp for doing the kind of linguistic research myself and my colleagues and our students do all the time. When I found out more about him, because I met his son and read his correspondence, I discovered that while he was inside, he wasn't just a prisoner. He taught literacy to other prisoners because he was an educated person, and he collected their stories. And one of the first letters he wrote when he got out was to Menéndez Pidal, the other guy at the top right there. He wrote a letter saying, here's some of the material I took down, some of the stories I took down. We didn't have writing materials. I memorized these. I'm transcribing them now because I think they would be of interest for our research. So he remained a researcher and a teacher even in conditions of prison. The connection here, you're going to say, how do you get from 1936 Spanish Civil War to Gaza? Well, during my research there, I met a librarian who had become a regional culture minister, and she was working on Navarro Tomas, bottom right guy, who happened to also have been, in addition to a linguist, a librarian. He was taking during the war, his job was looking after the National Library. He had become an exile for 40 years. He died in exile in New York. She was busy rehabilitating him. This was in 2006, 7, 8. She wanted me to speak about his linguistics work because she knew about his work as a librarian. It turns out that this librarian culture minister was also involved in Librarians for Palestine. She was also involved, through her work as a culture minister, with bringing arts and literature programs into the prisons in her region. So it's a theme that threads itself back through this story, is that the people that are doing this work, some of us end up on the inside, others of us end up working with people who are on the inside of prisons, and this just went away. How about this? There we go. So that brings us to the story that Lorraine mentioned in her introduction. Why Gaza? You may or may not have heard about the different flotillas to Gaza. I won't give you the whole history because it's a long one. But basically Gaza, the little green rectangle there, is a strip of land, one very small, 360 square kilometers, one of the most densely populated places in the world, which has been called by a British journalist, Lauren Booth, she's actually Tony Blair's sister-in-law, but don't blame that on her, it's not her fault. He's part of one of the people responsible for Gaza's predicament. She was on one of the early voyages that arrived in Gaza in 2008. Lauren Booth said, we compare Gaza to an open-air prison. You've got 1.7 or 1.8 million people living in these incredibly dense conditions with very, very few basic civil rights or human rights provided by the occupying force or occupying power. She said, but in fact, it's even worse than a prison, because in a normal prison in our countries, people know when they're going to get their meals. In Gaza, they don't know when they're going to get their meals. People in prison normally know what the term of their sentence is. People in Gaza don't know when their sentence is going to end. Normally in our countries, we don't imprison children. The population of Gaza is mostly younger than most of you. The average age, the median age is 18. That means half of the population is 18 or younger. Children should not be subjected to this kind of conditions anywhere in the world for crimes that they could not possibly be responsible for. So one of the other people I learned from in this process is another teacher who happens to also have been a political prisoner, Bob Lovelace. He actually spoke the other day as part of the Prison Justice Film Festival here in London. Bob Lovelace is a former chief of the Ardoch Algonquin First Nation in Ontario. And I'm looking for my watch because I don't remember where I put the time. Here we are. No, that's the cartoons. Is that going to help us? And the time would be?
2:15.
What?
2:15.
Clock is up there. That's handier. Okay, so we're good. Bob is former chief of the Ardoch Algonquin First Nations in Ontario, but a former political prisoner because he went to jail for more than 3 months because he and others were defending their people's traditional lands against uranium mining. When Bob sailed with us, when we tried to sail from Greece in 2011, he made it very clear that he considers that he's sailing as an Aboriginal person to the largest Indian reserve in the world, is what he called Gaza. And when he was asked by press and other people, why don't you go through official channels? Why don't you go the way they tell you to go? His answer was this. As Indigenous people, one of the things we've learned about colonialism is that you never ask the oppressor for permission. After that talk, that was a big press conference in Athens, somebody came up and said she wanted her picture taken with Mr. Lovelace. Anybody recognize her? That's Pulitzer Prize winning author Alice Walker. Alice was with the US boat to Gaza, and what she had just said in the press conference and many times before is that these voyages to Gaza, our attempts to challenge and break the blockade of Gaza, are for her the freedom rides of our generation. Alice was, of course, around in the generation in the 50s and 60s that broke segregation against African Americans in the US. In part, not only, but mostly because of their own actions, right? But in part because other people joined them and rode with them, took some of the risks with them to challenge an unjust system. So for Alice, it's part of the same struggle that we should today be putting ourselves on the line to challenge the blockade of Gaza and stand with the Palestinians of Gaza. Alice is also famous for that quote, that activism is the rent for living on the planet. What happened, very briefly, I won't go into all the details, there was this deal between the Israeli government and the Greek government that locked us down, so we were only able to sail, in our case, for about 15 minutes before being stopped by the Greek Coast Guard. A couple of our friends, we have here Mike from Sydney, Australia, and Suha from Ottawa, coined the term kayaktivism that day because they used a couple of small paddle boats to block the Coast Guard. We got out of port, but not for very long. Mike and Suha and one other Canadian, Sandra Rush, who used to live here in London, went to jail that day so the rest of us could sail. They weren't in jail for very long. We had good lawyers in Greece. They got them out in a few days. But they also took the risk, as the rest of us did. Later that year, as Lorraine mentioned, we took the Tahrir, the Canadian boat, not from a Greek port, because that wasn't possible, from a Turkish port. We sailed. At that point, we were able to sail not just out of port, we were able to sail almost all the way towards Gaza. And I show the map here because one of the lies that's told about us is we were sailing towards Israeli waters. We never sailed towards Israeli waters. None of the flotillas ever did. Our course was always through international waters to Palestinian waters off Gaza. That's our destination. None of us wanted to go to Israel willingly. Didn't turn out the way we wanted to, but it was not our intention. What happened So there's the 6 of us on the Tahrir in November talking on the phone to the media. Eventually we're attacked, as is predictable, by the, in a way, at that point was predictable by the Israeli military. After all our communications are cut off, of course. Water cannons were boarded with heavily armed men. And we end up in this place called Givon Prison. And if I could have queued up the laptop, I would have shown you some footage, not from us, but from other people who were imprisoned there, what it looks like on the inside of the prison. The important thing about being any kind of prisoner anywhere, but in particular in the case if you're there for political reasons, is that you're not forgotten. And we were very privileged in that there were people aware of our situation, talking about our situation. So we were only there for 6 days, which isn't all that long. It's long enough to get an idea of what it's like to have other people in control of your prison, of your freedom, or your lack of freedom of movement. But the fact is we were never alone. There were people here and in many other places talking about our situation. Much, much longer time in prison. I'll jump to a more recent past. Last fall you may have heard about John Grayson and Tariq Lubani, both of whom are connected to this community, who spent 50 days in prison in Egypt. Again, they were just doing their jobs. Tariq is a doctor, John is a filmmaker. They happened to be in a situation where Tariq was doing emergency medicine and John was documenting it, as a filmmaker would do. They were arrested for doing their jobs in a place where the authorities didn't want them to be doing their jobs. And they spent much longer in prison than any of us hoped. John is also being here participating in the Prison Justice Film Festival. He spoke last Friday. He'll speak next Friday at Western about one of his films. The crazy thing for me is, years before any of this happened, John had already made 2 or 3 or 4 beautiful films about prison issues before he had experienced this himself. And of course now he has a very interesting perspective as somebody who's been on the inside. But one of the things they talk about, and they've done some great interviews since they got out, and John mentioned this the other night, is the importance, first of all, of prison solidarity. So the 30 or 40 men that were with them, they all talked and presented different things about their knowledge. So as with Otero that I was speaking about before, people shared and taught and learned what during that experience. But also he said this reflects the importance of what Blanco was doing, what the culture minister in Spain was doing, bringing arts, bringing literature, bringing expression into prisons. And on the other hand, the most serious thing you can do to somebody in prison is forget about them, deprive them of that kind of contact. And the most serious way of doing that is when people are in solitary. The fact is today in Egypt, in the same prison where they were, there are people in solitary confinement for being journalists. There's an Al Jazeera journalist called Fahmy who is being deprived of any human contact in solitary confinement because he was doing his job as a journalist. So if you think, it's tough to be a journalist, tough to work in the media here, it's tougher in some places. The important thing is we can't necessarily change the reality there, but we can remember the people on the inside. Remember the people in prison. Jumping back to Gaza, so it was actually my second and third attempt when we didn't sail from Greece and when we sailed from Turkey and got to 40 or 50 nautical miles from the coast of Gaza before being stopped and imprisoned. I had tried to travel by land through Egypt in 2010, and finally in 2012 with a group of colleagues we traveled to Gaza to the International Conference on Applied Linguistics with a group of colleagues that included a linguist that even non-linguists have heard of, Noam Chomsky. So we finally got there in November of 2012, or October of 2012. We left in November. What happened in November was another naked aggression against the Palestinians of Gaza, which we wrote about. And the thing is, when you write with Noam Chomsky, you get published a lot. So the piece that we wrote about Chomsky wasn't, the rest of the authors didn't usually figure, but Chomsky and others got a little bit of media play in a few places because we were able to denounce the lies that you're hearing in the Western media about that aggression, right? Because they choose to repeat one narrative and not use a narrative which is obvious to anybody who's been on the ground there and listens to the people who are suffering that aggression. Reasons that we do this, I'll just show here one image from a friend who was with us on the Tahrir in Greece. She's a Belgian photojournalist, Asma Seba, who took this picture in a refugee camp in Gaza of a little girl who says that what happened to her family happens because everybody is with the power. Stop. Wait a second. everybody's with Israel, we feel forgotten, but when we see those boats coming, we don't feel so alone. So this is why we have to continue to raise awareness about the prison that is Gaza. The worse than prison is Gaza, not because of the adults necessarily, though they're in a bad situation too, with terrible unemployment, massive poverty, isolation, etc., but for the children who need some kind of hope for the future, right? So the plea here from Hind and her little brother is to not forget them, and that's the message that I got and my colleagues got from the young people like you that we met at the universities and colleges and in the streets and in the cafes in Gaza, was their thirst for contact with the outside world, right? Their desire to just interact the way everybody else does, the possibility, if they get a scholarship or an admission from a foreign university, to be able to travel there, to be able to travel to other parts of Palestine for health or education or family reasons or whatever. So it's for them that we continue to challenge Gaza. I'll just say a few words now about Gazas Arc, our current campaign to challenge the blockade of Gaza. We've been sailing for a number of years. In 2008, there were voyages that were able to arrive in Gaza and leave and didn't threaten anybody's security. But from 2009 until last year, or actually until 2012, the occupying power has chosen to violently stop the various boats that have been traveling. We've decided this time to continue to challenge the blockade, but we're challenging it from the inside out. So we're rebuilding a boat in Gaza to sail outward. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that this whole discourse of is this a threat to somebody's security doesn't hold water, so to speak, if you're sailing from the inside out, because there can be no threat to anybody sailing inside out. The fact is there's no threat to anybody sailing from the outside in either. None of the boats in our flotilla movement has ever been found to have anything dangerous, but there's especially no threat sailing from the inside out. But more important than that, our Palestinian friends in Gaza have told us they don't want to be identified with as recipients of aid. They need aid now, but they also know that they should have an export economy. There's lots of brilliant young people like you who desire nothing more than to have a productive economy, and they used to have it. Okay, so 20, 25 years ago, Gaza had an export sector. It had agricultural exports, industrial exports, has lots of smart people who can do this, but their agricultural production and their industrial production has been systematically destroyed. So what we're doing here is, on the one hand, helping them rebuild one boat, which is not huge, but it's a lot more than has been happening for many, many, many years. Nobody can remember the last time somebody rebuilt a whole boat for an ocean voyage there. So people are working in the port of Gaza on this project, right, inside this huge open-air prison. And at the same time, we're selling export goods. Whatever they have, whatever they're producing in their agricultural cooperatives that they have a surplus of, that they were ready to sell to the world, we're finding contracts, purchasers for them in Europe, in North America, in Australia, in South Africa, people who are willing to say, we can't get on the boat with you, small boat. There's going to be 15 people, Palestinians, internationals, crew, media, right? So not a ton of people on board. Lots of people want to support it, so the message is lots of people get on board, not with the voyage itself, but with the campaign. And they're on board by saying, we can't risk ourselves on the boat, but we can risk our purchases. Okay, so they're using their power as purchasers to say, we're going to buy $500 worth of dates or embroidery or whatever the people in Gaza are producing, and we have agricultural associations, women's cooperatives in the refugee camps, different groups like this, cultural associations that are producing goods that are being bought by these purchasers in different parts of the world. And then we use that to change the political discourse in our country, to go to our leaders and say, why is it that Israel has free trade with Canada, Israel has free trade with Europe, and the occupied Palestinian territories face a blockade, in the case of Gaza, that prevent them from getting their goods out? Why is there a double standard here? Why do these people not benefit from free trade? Our governments always love to tell us the benefits of free trade. Why are these people in prison not able to benefit from the freedom of movement that would give them free trade? Personally, I think there are lots of benefits to freedom of movement that have nothing to do with trade. The freedom to travel to study, for health reasons, for family reasons, just because traveling is fun. But trade is also part of that. The ability to run an economy depends on the ability to trade. I mean, imagine if all of southwestern Ontario had to only export through Port Huron, and on top of that, the people on the other side of the bridge at Port Huron could decide, today the bridge is open, tomorrow the bridge is closed, and you know what, it's closed indefinitely. That's the case in Egypt, because Egypt is enforcing the Israeli blockade on the only border crossing that Palestinians in Gaza can use. So if all of our economy had to go out one place, it would do very serious things to all of the productive activities in our communities. And if on top of that it was controlled by the occupying power who has an interest in suffocating our economy, that would have an even bigger impact, if you can imagine, on 1.7 or 8 million people, right? So what we're trying to do is say, look, these people don't need to travel through one little border crossing. They've got a border on the sea. In fact, it's the only port on the sea, on the Mediterranean Sea, which is not open to commercial navigation. It's the only port that Palestine has. It should be open to commercial navigation. So we're going to peacefully export some stuff, hopefully this spring. Whatever happens to that voyage, and obviously people like me, who've been kidnapped by the Israeli military and held against our will, people who've invested in our boats before, organizations who've backed us before, are very aware of the risks of these voyages. Okay, so we go into this with our eyes open. Our view is that whatever happens to the voyage, it's already a victory as soon as we leave the dock. Why is it a victory when we leave the dock? Because nobody has built a boat like this in Gaza in decades. Actually, as long as anybody can remember. An ocean-going boat that could cross the Mediterranean. They have little fishing boats that are restricted to a very, very, I'll show you in a minute, a very, very small piece of the coast, right? But just having that economic activity is already a victory. Just selling the goods, and the Palestinian producers will be paid for their goods before the boat leaves, is already a victory. Because these is an imprisoned population that doesn't have access to markets. They're going to be paid. The commercial risk is going to be borne by people like us on the outside who have the confidence to buy the goods. And then we use it, the fact that we're owners of these goods, to address the injustice here and take the injustice to our governments. Because the fact is, the reason this occupation continues and the reason this brutal, inhuman blockade continues is because our governments allow for it. Mr. Harper's government is among the first in the world, if not the first in the world, in supporting this injustice. So little boats in the east of the Mediterranean are in fact little floating platforms that allow us to speak about that here, because the change needs to happen here. It needs to happen in Ottawa, in Washington, in Westminster, in Paris, in Sydney, in Melbourne, and in Johannesburg, right? In all of the countries that are supporting this, and many more, in Europe especially, we're changing the discourse by saying, no, this is about freedom for the Palestinians and the support and complicity of our governments for their ongoing suffering under this blockade. So this is a way of bringing it home. Even though it's happening far away, the fact that the purchasers are here in this community and communities like this is a way of bringing the political debate here where we need to change things. Because the crimes that are happening against the Palestinian people are made possible by our government's failure to hold the Israelis accountable to for their actions. Another issue with the blockade is the issue of fishing. So Gaza, again, it's a coast. Traditionally, they have a lot of fishing. Can you imagine any country in the world where their fishing territory is, or their fishing waters are constrained from first 20 nautical miles to 12 to 6 to only 3, the sandy coastal waters, which are highly contaminated because they can't process their sewage, because they can't get fuel, they can't fix the machines because of the blockade. So they don't have the machinery to run a sewage treatment plant. They have contaminated waters. They can't sail beyond 3 nautical miles. The fishing industry is being destroyed. One of the boats, the boat that we were able to buy, is for one of those fishing families who can't make a living anymore. But by challenging this arbitrary 3-mile limit, we're saying these people have the right to access the sea the same way every other coastal people in the world can access their own sea for commercial purposes, for all peaceful economic purposes, right? So we're talking about freedom of movement. We're talking also about building hope, right? A very basic idea, as I said before, is to give some hope to those young people we saw before, to young people like you who are in school and don't see a lot of future. And when I mention hope, I like to mention this citrus box. Anybody care to hazard a guess? I put London, Ontario there. The picture was taken here not quite 25 years ago by a local artist called Ron Benner. Gaza oranges and lemons were exported to not the current Covent Garden, but the former Covent Garden market, which is where the picture was taken, and the brand was called Gaza Hope. They were exported through Israel at the time. Since then, why is there no citrus production sold here? Why can you not buy Gaza fruit here or in Europe or anywhere else? Because of the blockade? and because of the aggression. The orchards were systematically destroyed in several campaigns. Remember, these were billed in our media as security campaigns because the Palestinians of Gaza were threatening the security of Europe. I'm still trying to figure out why they destroyed hen houses and chicken farms. Chickens aren't usually terrorists, or orange orchards. It's really hard for me to understand how those oranges became lemons, became, somehow threatening as terrorist acts. But the fact is the orange orchards and the lemon orchards and all of the infrastructure for export were systematically destroyed, such that the thousands of people that used to earn a living through citrus export no longer can. So, and the brand, I just love the brand name. Gaza Hope came as a complete surprise when Ron showed me the image, because we had already been, for months, talking about the campaign that was building hope. So we're just rebuilding this brand, this idea of hope for Gaza, with the Freedom Flotilla, with the right to fish and freedom of movement for Gazawis, the Palestinians of Gaza. So that's an open-air prison in what seems like a distant part of the world, but with the theme of what you can learn in prisons. I learned a great deal. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily as a place to go and learn, but I learned a great deal in prison, among other from the Irish people who were there, who have a different understanding of what it means to be a political prisoner, a much longer history with the idea of political prisoners and resistance to occupation. But you can learn this kind of lesson, as I said, closer to home. So the people that are buying the products, the export products that will go on Gazas Arc in the spring, some of them are in this community, right? So people are buying stuff here. But you can also learn about what it means to be in prison in this community. So as I said, John Grayson, the filmmaker, was here last Friday. He will be here again next Friday, talking about one of his other films that touches on prison issues, Proteus. It's about prison in South Africa during colonial times. But there's a whole festival of free films, the Prison Justice Film Festival, which touches on all kinds of different issues related to prisons. Because the fact is, here in our communities, in our country, prisons are at the intersection of a large number of issues. People, and again, this touches what we talked about before, the idea that classrooms are a little bit like prison. If you think about the people who get in trouble when you were in school, when I were in school, for certain groups of people who are marginalized in our schools as institutions, and this is the not so good side of the institution, right? It can be a place of liberation. It can also be a place of punishment and, in the end, incarceration. So there's a pipeline for certain bad students, the ones who don't fit, and guess what? They tend to be overrepresenting students of color, indigenous populations, queers, two-spirited people, people who don't fit for any number of reasons, tend to be overrepresented in the ones that are marginalized in our school system and the ones who end up in prison. So when we have this, you can't read all of the writing here, but that's okay because we have the handout. So Lorraine has some programs that you can grab later and some little handbills about the Prison Justice Film Festival. As I said, it already started, but it continues this evening through Sunday with discussions about things like substance users and the war on drug users, war on substance users as something that involves the prison industrial complex. It involves sex trade workers and the prison industrial complex. As I said, queers in prison. Political prisoners in Colombia will be a theme on Saturday with another organization Lorraine mentioned, the Latin American Canadian Solidarity Coalition. And people will be talking about another issue which is of local concern and provincial concern in Ontario, which is the situation of migrant workers in prison. So the fact is that we bring migrants to this country to do agricultural work that we don't pay enough for in Southern Ontario, among other places, and then lock some of them up, and some of these migrants are in indefinite high security detention in federal or provincial facilities, as they call them, prisons, here in Ontario. So they get locked up for a certain length of time. They supposedly get their detention reviewed, but the review simply renews their detention. So in fact, in violation of international norms, some of them are in detention indefinitely. We're talking 5, 7 years, without access to medical or legal attention. And in fact, John and Tarek, again, when they came back from Egypt, one of the first things they did was visit this facility outside of Lindsay, Ontario. Tarek, as a doctor, said, I want to see some of these people, they're sick. And the prison officials, our prison officials, wouldn't give them access to an independent medical doctor who was visiting, who was Tarek. And as Tarek said, this is even worse than they happened to them in Egypt. In Egypt, they told them no, but eventually the Canadian authorities were able to get them independent medical attention. The Canadian authorities here, for foreigners locked up here, for migrants locked up here, didn't even get that standard of access. So this is a problem in our communities. So as I say, you don't have to travel to a far part of the world necessarily to learn some of these lessons. Some of these lessons are being learned right here in London, Ontario. So I wanted to finish with one quote from somebody who is another great teacher. I don't think he went to prison, but he was threatened with prison for most of the 1950s. He died earlier this week, this guy, Pete Seeger. He was threatened with prison because of his political views in the US. He refused to testify at the House Committee on Un-American Activities because they wanted him to name names of other people who were involved in political movements, and he refused to name names. And he stood on his constitutional rights. He was in fact sentenced to prison. He was eventually, that sentence was eventually overturned on appeal. But he's one of the people that apart from his music and the lyrics, he's one of the people that I look to because of the courage to say, if a law is unjust, then the only principled thing to do is to be among those that's willing to challenge the law, even if that means putting ourselves in line to go to jail. The trick is, as he says, not to go to jail too often, right? Because you need some people on the outside to support the ones on the inside. Though sometimes it can be interesting to have so many people that you fill the jails. That's one strategy. You also have to think, am I the one to go today to the front lines? We can't all be on the front lines all the time, otherwise it ends up being a very thin line. So there's a role for you. I'm not here to say you have to be out there doing something that gets you in trouble and gets you in jail. I'm saying be aware of the fact that there are injustices here in our community that are reflected by what populations are in jail and why. Be aware of them, talk about them, think about them, learn about them. Some of that learning can fit in your classrooms. Not all of that learning has to fit inside the mental prison, the mental bars of the classroom. The graphic, again, for the, let's go backwards. The graphic, again, for the Prison Justice Film Festival are, old analog film strips like prison bars. So you don't need to be inside the prison bars of the classroom or the prison to necessarily learn these lessons. You can learn these lessons in your community if you open your mind to talking to the people who have some of these experiences, and they are all around us, okay? We don't talk about it enough. We need to talk about it more. So Seeger knows that. Lots of the people I've been talking about know that. One of his songs, which we're trying to pull up here, let me make this go. This should scroll, but it's not scrolling. Doesn't matter. Anyway, one of his songs that I remember at this time, to everything there's a season for every purpose under heaven. There's a time to talk about happy things, there's a time to talk about prisons. And I can't make it scroll, but that's technology for you. Time for everything. So this is a time for questions, because one of the things that's very important to me about education is that it doesn't just come from this side of the classroom to that side of the classroom. So when I've stopped learning from the people in the room is when I'm going to stop teaching. So I'd be happy to take your question. If you want to know more about either of the things I'm talking about, you've got Gazas Arc on the web, on Facebook and on Twitter, and the Prison Justice Film Festival on WordPress. I have a question here.
Yeah. What is your affiliation with Gaza? Like, are you Jewish or Palestinian?
No, I'm a human being.
Oh.
My affiliation is with humanity. Seriously, I take that very seriously. It's an ongoing conflict, which is, well, I don't know what the noise is coming from. No, it's simply, I got into this through the peace movement because it's been the object of many wars and much aggression. But when I learned about, and it's a matter of education, when I learned about the violation of their right of freedom of movement in particular, and the impact that was having on their economy, on their young people, on their education and health systems, basically the decision was, and I'm not alone in this, the decision of many people from many walks of life and many backgrounds was, we can't leave these people alone. We have to remember them, because what the Palestinians of Gaza tell us is the same thing that people in prison tell us. Don't forget about us. The worst thing that can happen when you're in prison is to be forgotten. The worst thing that can happen to the Palestinians of Gaza is to be forgotten, and they know that they can't depend on governments. The governments of the world say things sometimes, but they don't do anything. That's why civil society, by which I mean people like us, student organizations, unions, faith groups, whatever, have to remember them and act. So that's the affiliation. Humanity, civil society, grassroots groups. We agree.
I was just wondering, besides this movement that you're so passionately impacted on, and that it is really personal to you, I just wanted any those social issues that you're passionately about?
How long have you got?
Well, like name like top two.
Well, I started talking about the labor movement, so I talked about picket lines, which you might or might not see here or at other workplaces. That's a vast one in Canada. And the labor pushback, the labor fight back against the austerity agenda, it's a big word, austerity agenda. It basically means Mr. Harper and people like Harper's government want you to pay more for your education and get less, pay more for healthcare and get less, pay more in general and get less in general. Okay, so and have less chance at working, less wages when you work, less benefits, less security when you work, especially your generation. Okay, so the labor fight back against the austerity agenda is huge. Something I forgot to put up here, but look for it. The Regional Social Forum in London in June or July this summer. We'll be building towards the People's Social Forum in Ottawa in August. It's about all of these movements, the environmental movement, the labor movement, indigenous rights movements, pushing back against the Harper austerity agenda. So that's an important one that affects us all here and around the world. It's connected to the other ones. All of these things are interconnected. The environmental movement, one of the things we were talking about the other night with Bob Lovelace was the fact that indigenous people here, and Chomsky talks about this too, indigenous people around the world are at the forefront of environmental defense. So if we talk about people who are taking the lead in opposing tar sands and opposing pipelines that bring toxic petroleum across traditional Aboriginal territory, it's going to be the Chippewa of the Thames, the Anishinaabe down near Sarnia, who are taking the lead in this region and opposing them. We may not all be ready to stand at the line, stop the machines that are doing that work against our Mother Nature, but we better be aware of the importance of supporting them when they do, and that's going to be coming down very, very soon. Watch for it. Brother at the back. There are more. We can talk about it more. I'm not going away fast. Sorry, I can't hear. Yes.
About 15,000 people died, and those are conservative people. 10,000 tons of destruction were caused on innocent civilians, men, women, children, and those are conservative people. Then weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, about 500,000 civilians died. And what do Britain and Americans say when they don't find these weapons? They simply say sorry. Then why? Then I'm about to ask again that who are those people in power? Like the government are the people. This is a democracy, right? We say government of the people, by the people, and for the people, right? Like we the people, we the civilians, we are the ones that like we voted them in power, right? For them to govern us, because we all can be in power. Then they now fighting back against us, like, and I want to ask, who are those people in power? Who are the bosses in power that are killing everyone, and not making everyone? Yeah.
They're the same ones Mark Twain was opposing more than a century ago in the Anti-Imperialist League. So the powers that fight those wars, and they claim to represent us, are imperial powers. The big ones, as you said, in the US and the UK, but many other imperial powers back them up, including Canada. Okay? So yes, we bear the responsibility because these are our governments. I disagree with you about how what's called democracy actually works. It's supposed to be by and for the people. It doesn't actually work that way. So one of the things we'll talk about in the People's Social Forum is building real democracy. Because in fact we have a fake democracy where the parties that get elected never actually challenge militarism. Okay? Militarism is what you're talking about, the use of force. There are people who get very, very rich from that. But it isn't you and it isn't me. And it isn't most of the people in this room. So the power of militarism is what we need to challenge. Absolutely, I agree with you. We haven't been successful in doing it through the ballot box. We have to build a movement that can challenge militarism. I agree with you completely. Not only that, we have to challenge it in such a way that we transform the industries like the ones that are down Oxford here, that build assault vehicles, to say no, we want the good jobs in our local economy not to depend on building killing machines, but building public transit and building renewable energy and things that we need.
Well, secondly, you said you sold from Greece to Gaza.
We tried to, yes.
Back in 1993, Professor Rubio was there, Senator Rubio was there, Canadian.
Yeah.
He said he called the UN like, to fight against the war, the killing in Rwanda. But they couldn't say anything, they couldn't do anything because they knew Rwanda they don't have oil. And you can say killing in Afghanistan is all about liberating the people for the means of stealing the country's oil. So then I want to like.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're kind of out of time and people are starting to pack up and go. Maybe I would recommend you come down and talk to David after, but I don't want to see everybody just sort of trickle away before I've had a chance to thank David.
I think it's a question at the end.
Yeah. So anyway, before you all have to go and run off to other classes, I want to thank David again for coming. David, this is a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for coming.